Today, the star of the show is you. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and not so long ago I made a post on my community tab where I asked you to ask me some historical questions, and then I made you a promise telling you that I would have made an episode answering those questions. Here we are. The post is still there, and today I'm just going to select as many as we can, but I will be turning this into a series, so feel free to find the post and ask more questions. You might be picked for the next episode if you haven't been picked today. Let's go. Nob S Survival says, question, if you were a knight and could ride any animal into battle, what dinosaur would you ride? This question probably deserves a dedicated video. I'm not sure if it deserves a dedicated video, but if it were me, I would say a raptor. It's basically like a power version of Final Fantasy Chocobos. Makino Atoir says, I always liked how many things we take as modern existed in the far past, but in a more primitive version of it. A video talking about it or telling your favorite would be a very cool thing to listen. I made 2. Links in the description. Mo1 says, hello sir, awesome channel. Thank you. Thank you for your content. I'd love to know more about what people were drinking in historical times. I mean, did they even know how to boil water? Thanks in advance. Okay, if you go back to the first examples of pottery, which we're talking about 20,000 years ago in China, with a distance of a few thousand years in Europe, then of course, when you have pottery, you can boil water. But water was boiled even before the invention of pottery. That's when it becomes interesting. There is some archaeological evidence that the discovery of boiling water in fact is from the Paleolithic, and it predates obviously the invention of metal, but also the invention of pottery. And there were several ways this could be achieved. Either you use a natural container, for example the stomach of an animal, like a pig. But the one that I find most fascinating is the idea of taking the skin of a deer and making a container out of it. Then you hang it on top of trees. You fill it with water, and then you warm the water through stones. Now really check this one out. What there is evidence for is that they took stones, started a fire with them, left them on the fire until these stones would become really hot, and then they would put these very hot stones into the water. Now mind you, before you decide to try this at home, don't, because depending on what stone you use, if you use, for example, wet stones from a river, they will explode upon contact with the water because of the creation of the steam. Don't do it, it can be dangerous. The type of stone that seems to be working for this are either granite or basalt stones. And as they get really warm and then they are put into the water, it has been proven that they can, with their heat, bring the water to a boil inside of a deer skin. Fascinating. Still don't try it at home. Nera 5948. What is your favorite historical era, or eras, if you have more than one? And thank you for your content, really great to see. Well, thank you so much for watching. Favorite historical eras, I'm going to say late medieval Italy, early Renaissance, kind of that late 15th century, early 16th century type, or the Principate, so sort of classical Rome between the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Imperial time, so early Principate. But also I'm very interested in dynastic 15th century China during the Ming dynasty or Ming Chao, and also feudal Japan. I would say I'm interested in the Sengoku period, not that I would have wanted to live in the Sengoku period, but I'm interested in studying it. Some Era Guy 2903. I would greatly enjoy a series about reviewing various different pieces of armor that are less than acceptable, like Amazon armor. Yeah, I think you mean like the sort of bikini armor that has less to do with body protection and more to do with sex appeal. Well, believe it or not, that's not a trope that was created in the modern time. In fact, if you look at something like the ancient Roman gladiatrices, so the female gladiators, they are reported to be fighting with exposed breasts. So, I mean, men like what they like. Seems like we haven't changed that much. Era UK9UC. I'm trying to make a story and I need to know if Greatswords were around in the 12th and 13th century. If they are not, I'll just have the character wield a spear. Thank you, edit. Oh, and ancient Egypt. I'd love to hear more about ancient Egypt during the Bronze Age. Okay, so here you are sort of stepping into nomenclature hell, so be prepared for it. Already it's quite difficult to decide when a longsword ends and a greatsword begins, in the sense that not only varies from the interpretation of modern scholars and HEMA practitioners, but also in period. A montante in the Iberic Peninsula, a spadone in Italy, a greatsword in England, even though that word was actually not used that much, but it was used. A Zweihänder in Germany, again, not a period term. All of these words didn't always perfectly represent the same sword that you have in mind, but if you are setting your story in the 12th and 13th century, I would say probably not, because when you think of great swords in the sense of the sort of swords that are normally taught in treatises such as Marozzo, Alfieri, Di Grassi, then that's all like late 15th, 16th century stuff, and it would not be accurate to this period. It would be anachronistic. Either give a long sword to the character, or as you say, just give him a polearm. It could be a spear, it could be a bill. Emerald Wolf, that's a cool name, says, left-handedness in history. You always do great work, sir. Thank you for all the hard work. Appreciate your words. When we talk about being left-handed in history, we should first divide in general or in a military context. When we talk about being left-handed in general, then unfortunately throughout history, oftentimes this was seen, it kind of depends on the culture, but if we speak in general, this was seen as a bad thing. Sometimes it was correlated with black magic, and oftentimes there is a sort of superstitious approach to the fact that some people could be left-handed. Now, given some very famous people were left-handed, like for example Charlemagne, and it's not like anyone was going to tell the king that you are into witchcraft, not gonna happen. But for people who perhaps belonged to the low class, it was never a good thing to be left-handed historically, and it wasn't treated very well. And even though we have overcome this sort of superstition, we can still see the vestiges of this form of belief in our languages, including English. Of course, in English the words are left and right, but if you look at adjectives such as sinister or dexterous, then you'll notice that they come specifically from the Latin words to say left and right, meaning that the left side is called sinistrum in Latin, and then when you say that something is sinister, it has a sort of veil of evil, wicked into it, doesn't it? Even in English. On the other hand, when you say that someone is dexterous, you're talking about their skills, their ability, their dexterity, their agility. It has a positive connotation, and then what comes from dexter in Latin, which once again means right. Within a military context, then, what happened if you were a legionary but you were left-handed? Well, you were forced to use your sword like a right-handed person. It's as simple as that. And I want to say that in a military context, in most countries, this is what would have happened, particularly if you're talking about a cohesive line of soldiers, because you can't fight with your shield on the right and your sword on the left and then break the line of either, whether it be shield walls or whether it be formation in general, even if it's not a compact formation. A left-handed soldier would have been forced to learn to use the sword with the right hand. Same for a medieval knight. The lance is on the right, no matter what. DHXW6JP. Not history related, I know, already breaking the rules, but it's related to this channel. Will you ever add googly eyes to the top of your frogmouth helmet? Colossal Sword Form and Technique asks, what is your opinion on great swords, colossal swords, and Krabi Krabong dual swords? I personally am not a fan of dual sword stance. Well, personally, I don't like dual swords either. I know that there are people that can use it very effectively, but I always like to have control of my sword with both hands. So any style of combat that I've tried in my life, sword combat, I always prefer to use both hands on the sword, and if I was to use one hand, depending on what sword I'm using, I would use the other hand for a shield. Heated shield would be my first choice, but if I'm a buckler, I would prefer it over dual wielding. Before the domestication of beetroot, how did people enjoy their meals? Do what? Messianic Resources asks, if you are in the US now, yes I am, are you planning on doing videos about historical firearms? In particular, I would like to see a video regarding the Lemat revolver if you are. I'm not, because YouTube is not very forgiving. Firearms and YouTube do not go well together. Too dangerous, so I'm not gonna do that. Sorry about that. Just van der Velden 8777 says, I always wondered how the explorers of the Americas communicated with the locals people, considering the language gap, at least the moment they first interacted. Okay, the topic of communication between early explorers before the times where translators were available and the local natives is actually a very fascinating topic, but I'll try to encapsulate it into a few words. Let's talk about it in general first, and then we'll talk specifically about, for example, conquistadores, or the people that actually went from Europe, the old world, to the Americas. In general, early explorers and conquerors, what they did is as they reached a new area, they usually tried to go with a common language. So if no one in your culture, for example, even the Romans, spoke the language of the people in freaking Narborensis, they would see if they can find someone else from another area that speaks the language of the locals because they had already interacted, and they also speak your language, then you take them with you. And this was done, for example, with Arabic as a language throughout the exploration of Africa. Now, of course, something like that is particularly difficult when you cross the Atlantic, particularly when you reach those areas for the first time, but there were other ways to do it. For example, the first thing that you would do as a European explorer, you would just ditch language altogether and communicate with gestures and pointing at things, so that you can at least establish a first very basic vocabulary of around 100 words that you can use to at least know what the heck you're on about. For instance, you can point at your ship and say the name for it, you can point at water, say the name for it, you can point at food, say the name for it in your language so that the locals can learn those words. This very simple technique would work for very basic interactions and even some forms of trading and barter. But eventually you need to step it up. The way you do it, two ways. Either you spend some time with the locals, so you take one of your guys, leave them with the locals, and then he will spend a few months with the locals and start learning the language. Alternatively, you can take one of the locals and bring it back to Europe so that they can be forced to learn the language. Usually this was done against their will. Now, one situation that happened with some of the first interaction with the Aztecs, for example, was the fact that they used some Inca translators. In the sense that contact with the Inca was established through a shipwreck, if I remember correctly, and one of the European navigators and explorers ended up living with the Inca, marrying an Inca, and learning their languages. And then the new explorers from Spain used this guy's wife, who had also learned their language, to communicate with some of the Aztecs, because she could speak the language of the Mexicas or the Aztecs, considering the relationship that had been happening for hundreds of years between those two civilizations. So as you can see, it's a multi-layered situation, but it's very interesting. Thank you for the question. Cosmic Odyssey 3382. What is the most effective way to research? Like if I need a specific country's history for a project. My suggestion would be to mostly focus on primary sources. As you know, when you do research, you deal with primary sources and secondary sources, and they should both be part of your research. But the difference between primary sources and secondary sources is that primary sources, you are looking at statistical evidence, eyewitness, and descriptions of people that saw whatever they're describing firsthand. Secondary sources, instead, you are reading the commentary from someone else, and oftentimes that can be problematic because no matter how professional you are and how unbiased you try to be, different historians will have different takes on the same primary sources. So my suggestion is always go to the primary sources first. This is what me and my team do. Sometimes this means that you need either to be able to read ancient languages, or you need to contact someone who can help you understand a primary source in another language. But even though it's more demanding and it takes longer, I think it's the best way. And then you can also use some secondary sources to do some cross-reference and see, okay, so these three historians, that's what they interpreted from this first primary source. Here's my interpretation, here's how I read it. And sometimes I think that's the best way to do research. Use both, but I would strongly focus on primary sources first. Celtic Templar asks, would you ever consider doing how-to videos in such how to dress as these certain warriors from history, such as from the 14th century or the Roman era, etc.? I actually already did. I have a how to make a Viking or Norse shield. Unfortunately, didn't get many views, but the video's there if you want to check it out. I think it's pretty good and very historically accurate, and I present all of the evidence and back up every single choice that we made when we recreated that shield. Again, I'll put a link in the description. And I do have a video where I show how to dress in samurai armor. So I've got a few of those, and will I make more? Kind of depends on how they do, really. But if many of you request them, then I will, so absolutely let me know in the comments. SimoClown2267 asks, I would love to see something about medieval Italian history. Most of the content on YouTube is about England, and it's been a long time since I was studying history at school. I am Italian, by the way. Buongiorno. I agree, that sounds really interesting. I'll look into it. Thank you very much for the suggestion. Joseph Ganyen4548 says, if a modern Italian was transported back to the Italian Renaissance period, would they still be able to communicate with people then? It depends where you send them. So if you send a modern Italian to the Renaissance period Tuscany, I want to say yes, you can communicate. You might need a few adjustments and you might need to kind of do a little practice, but in general, for the stuff that really matters and the core of the conversation, we modern Italians can read the likes of Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, La Divina Commedia, and generally speaking, kids, even high schoolers, can understand what they're reading unless they find those specific words that might be used differently, and then you will find a little translation at the bottom of the page. But I want to say that you can understand a good 80% of what you're reading. Now, if you were transported to the north of Italy in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, or you were transported to Sicily or Calabria, then the situation would be different, and I think it would be much harder to communicate. But in general, if I was sent to spend some time in Renaissance Italy, most likely, if I needed to travel a lot, I would use Latin, particularly if I'm talking with like royalty, clergy, and the educated elite. It would probably be easier to communicate in Latin, but if I'm talking to just the people, then yeah, I would try to use modern Italian, but then again, some things we would understand and some things we wouldn't.